Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Troy, and I have a great friend here. Super excited to have Ryan Lewick here with me today for a minute war. And Ryan, I'm so pumped that we finally got the time.
Yeah.
We literally been trying to get this recorded for months now. So appreciate your patience. A lot of that was on my end, but thanks for hanging in there and being willing to hop in. But
Yeah.
just real quick, Ryan and I go back, what do we say, 8 years, 9 years now?
I
Maybe
don't
even
know. Heather
longer.
and I have been married since 2014, so probably 12 years. That's how
Okay,
fast
yeah,
time
so
flies.
yeah, it is flying by. So Ryan and I, we first met through our wives. They were both nurses, and I think you guys were just dating,
Yeah.
and Caitlin and I were engaged, maybe.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah. I think the
so.
first time we met, you guys were engaged, and yeah.
Yeah. So it's just super cool getting to meet Ryan, and we just kind of hit it off from the get go, and just stayed in touch all throughout my time in the service. And then uh, what's really cool is Ryan. I'll let him speak on it, but his specialty is an NP in neuro, and when I remember a few years ago, you were out here in Alabama visiting, and we were sitting around the campfire, and I was just talking about TBI and just what leads to isolation and addiction. And I just remember sitting out there with you and you having some really valuable insight onto what's going on with TBI. And I really get to, because I'm so comfortable with you, we have that friendship. I just open up to you and I'm like, hey, here are real problems, like this is what guys deal with. And a lot of guys don't have that. A lot of guys don't have that person they can go talk to and like really open up about. So I just appreciate your friendship, and again, thanks for being willing to hop on here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a pleasure actually to be able to do it because I mean, I've been watching your guys' content and it's been great. And I think what you're putting out there is really good just for about anybody, but especially for people in your service line. That's a very difficult task. And what that does goes over and it flows over into the brain and how it works. And so, yeah, there's several things that can definitely play a role in to all the things you guys have been discussing, like isolation, addiction. How do we get out of this hole? There's so many things in regards to like traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, anxiety, depression. So yeah, kind of my background. I started actually out as a nurse's aide or a tech is what they called it in the ICU back in like 2005, and I started out in neurotrauma ICU. Never been in the hospital before, never been into a nursing home before. I just got enrolled in nursing school, so I had zero clue what things were, and so it kind of the path I think God put me on intentionally was because I wanted to be a physician for a long time, and then after I did some job shadowing days, I told my mom, I was like, I don't want to do that. And she goes, hey, why don't you go be a nurse? I'm like, Mom, I don't want my friends to make fun of me because this is, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so it was interesting, but then I got hooked up with neurotrauma as a tech, and then I worked my way into a nurse, and then just kept on going from there. And then I started switching around. So I was a nurse for probably almost like 7 to 8 years, and then started to go to MP school. And neuro was just kind of my passion because it was kind of, I grew up with a lot of ADHD, didn't know it until I got into college. And so I got bored real easily. Had like 20 different jobs before I actually got into the medical field. But
Yeah,
neuro really just kind of hit was because that it was like the last explored part of the body that people still don't know a lot about, and it's ever changing. So it always just grabbed my attention. And so it was something I've been very passionate about for all the years. And 9 years into this position now, almost, it'll be going on nine this end of this year, starting my ninth year. And so it's been quite a trip and a lot of learning. Let me tell you, that was a steep learning curve because even having 8 years experience in neurotrauma, you thought you just had a good grasp on how the brain worked, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. And so with the job came with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and things that I start to relate to a lot to my patients when I talk to them about these kind of things. So
wow, yeah. And guys, I can sit here and vouch for Ryan. I mean, he's a has a plethora of knowledge on this topic, and we'll probably just scratch the surface with this video, but yeah, I mean, you've been able to give me so much insight onto some of the stuff going on neurologically, and I just such a valuable asset that you'd come on here and share that information, and you've even offered to help in a few cases if guys are struggling.
absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of I've learned that from the physician I work with now. I mean, he's always happy to help, and he's like, "There's people out there who just need things," and so if they don't get them from us, who are they going to get them from? You know, and is it going to be done, with the utmost compassion and care? And he really has a whole heart to help people, especially people who don't have access. And so he's really, I think, kind of was the main thing that kind of stimulated me to do better at my job, and sometimes put the time in that I didn't really have to, but just felt the need to. And I feel like it's really God filled most of the time, because that compassion is just so hard to come across anymore when it comes to seeking health care, getting into appointments, and especially for those that we are serving right now and the ones that serve for our country, the VA, that's such a hard system to get into and get the actual access to care. And so if there's any way I can help, I'm more than happy to. My knowledge, I feel, is limited at times, but again, I'll take whatever I learned over the years and kind of give you my perspective, and then try to give you the best understanding of it. But if there's ever a question out there someone brings your way, if I can't answer it, I'll definitely know someone that can.
Yeah,
So
no,
I
that's
developed a lot of
awesome.
relationships in the hospital with like psychiatrists, psychologists, other neurologists, and so there's just use the access that we have.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I will just say, on a side note, Ryan is like a steel trap mind. We always laugh and joke about that. Ryan can remember conversations we had from the first night we met each other. So I'm like, man, this guy obviously knows something about neuro. Like he doesn't forget a single conversation. So I'm like,
Oh,
something to
I'm
learn from
afraid
you
that's
there.
the first thing to go too. That's the one thing that I think I've told my wife several times. Like, if that ever goes and I can't communicate or whatever, I'm like, let me go, because that's the only thing I look forward to is conversation and talking to
Yeah,
people, and hopefully, the memories are just what where we've been. It's also good to know where you've been, so you know where you're heading. I mean, you don't
yeah,
want to look in the past the whole time and be in the rearview mirror all the time. You want to be, looking forward. But if you know where you've been, you know how far you came. And I think
mm,
part of that is what people tend to lose sight of when they're in it, when they're going through it. They forget. All they remember is the good times they used to have, and what's currently at their season they're in is what's tends to be the biggest thing to overcome. And so that's, I don't know, that's just opinion of mine, but it's hard when you're right in the middle of it. You can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. You just don't know what's going to happen. So that usually stimulates a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. God tells us fear not, because He's in control, right?
mm,
And if we lead into those fears, then we're not going to be at our best, and it's going to be hard to get out of that hole. We can't do it ourselves. So
yeah. No, I think that's a great segue into, again, you and I have had so many conversations on this topic, but I think one of the biggest issues I keep bringing to your attention now is like this isolation, and
hmm
uh, that's, and we're going to use, guys, for this video, we're going to probably reference military service a lot. We're going to reference law enforcement a lot, but really, if anybody's going through this is kind of this is more of a broad, what's going on neurologically. I'm going to reference a lot of military just because that's my experience, obviously, and but yeah, this isolation, Ryan, like
yeah,
being at the Warriors Journey, that's the number one call we receive is
hmm
veterans get out and they, probably had a TBI
hmm
or have some sort of PTSD, and they're anxious. They don't want to go out. They can't even go to the grocery store. A big one I always hear is like, I don't want to be a burden to somebody else. And
right,
so it's like we start getting all these thoughts in our head, and then I don't know. I guess you just feel so overwhelmed that you're like, oh, I don't want to be a burden. So I guess I'll just, sit in my apartment and not come out, or sit in my house and not leave. And, you know, one more example that I'll give you, and I know this resonates with a lot of guys, is just there's almost like a fog in your mind, and
yeah,
uh, you know, I would leave for lunch. Back when I was in Colorado, I'd leave for lunch, and I would end up just driving around for an hour and a half, not really knowing where I was going or knowing what I was doing, and I would just kind of found myself like in this fog. And right before we shot this video, I actually told you I wrote this in a letter and sent it out to a bunch of former teammates or current SEALs, and just said, you know, what's going on with this fog in our brain, and guys were responding back, and it was unanimous. Everybody's like, yeah, I feel the same thing. And so that would be, a good spot to dive in of like what, from a neuro stance, why are we trying to isolate what's going on with this fog and any insight you have there.
Yeah. So, traumatic brain injuries, or TBI for short, is something that is kind of complex because it really depends on what part of the brain it was affected, and also what was the cause or the mechanism of injury. And so, in regards to traumatic brain injuries, they can lead to the most common symptoms like amnesia, confusion, fatigue. Those are probably some of the most common ones. But as the brain injuries get a little more severe, so if you took a hit to the head several times or you've had several concussions, you start to change your brain structurally. And a lot of times, depending on the mechanism. So let's say going forward, kind of like football players, CTE or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, those multiple concussions. Well, they're usually more frontal lobe. And so frontal lobe is kind of the part of the brain that controls like for behavior. And so like when we were in nursing school and, definitely what I do now, you isolate a lot of function based on where the injury occurred. And so there's an interesting thing called a homunculus. And so if you look those up, there's a motor symptom, there's a sensory symptom. It helps us like localize things based off exam. But when it gets into traumatic brain injuries, that can kind of just go all over the board. It's very, very hard to localize those because they're usually a little more diffuse or more spread out through the brain. So one of the things that I see a lot is the acute injury. We see a lot of those in the hospital, and some of those involve like bleeds in the brain. They can involve concussions. One of them called DAI, or diffuse axonal injury. What happens there is like they had a shearing effect. So if they were in a car accident and they had their head, they were in what we call a rotational injury. As it bounces back and forth the cranial vault inside your brain, it tends to move side to side. And so when it does that, sometimes it can shear these things called axons. And axons are the part of the brain that gets the signal from one side to the other. That's the major cell of the brain between like axons, dendrites, and then the nerve sheath that goes in between. And so when they start to separate, it's kind of like separating if you had a cord that was bit into or nicked into, and you get a signal problem with your computer or with your TV. So you may have a lot of miscommunication firing in the brain. So some of the major symptoms when you get into that, they definitely get you a little more apathetic, and so they don't have these normal feelings about things. You can have a lot more confusion, just brain fog, and then what you're talking about in general is more of that your brain's trying to make sense of your environment. And when there's miscommunications between these axons and neurons, whether it's related to like dopamine or serotonin, dopamine is a pretty common one because with people with apathy, they tend to lack that communication of dopamine, from my understanding. And so that becomes a problem because we talk about that in regards to apathy in particular. So, and PTSD comes in another form of it, but in regards to traumatic brain injuries and especially the frontal lobe, your behavior gets a little more blunted. You can get aggressive because you can't make sense of the environment anymore. There's a lot of confusion. It's kind of like, I always think of the brain as a computer, and I use it as an analogy a lot because if you put a lot of information into a computer and it can't process it, you don't have the right gear. There's a hardware issue, kind of like your CD-ROM or your keyboard or USB drive. That can be a physical function. And then there's a software issue, which is more of like, I always say the psychological component, like PTSD, anxiety, stress, people who have schizophrenia, bipolar. Your brain has some type of inadequacy of trying to communicate things and use these transmitters or use these signals appropriately. And so it tends to lead to a wide array of problems. And so, the amnesia, the confusion, those are, sometimes more associated with the deeper brain injuries. But it can be anywhere in the brain. It really doesn't have a local spot, which is why they're hard to treat. You just try to treat the symptoms the best you can. Over time, it proposes your brain to have a higher risk of bleeds sometimes. Like certain patients will have a higher risk of bleed if they've had a TBI or seizures. And those alone can be just so small that they're not really noticeable. And unless you catch them in time, like in the actual time they're happening, they can be very, very subtle, but can cause basically a miscommunication or overstimulation of the brain. And so if you overstimulate the brain, it's like, again, putting that information in the computer very, very quickly, if you do that or open up a lot of tabs all at once, the likelihood you're going to get a message saying no longer responding is pretty high.
Yeah.
And so your brain is trying to make sense of its environment. It likes very well automated a lot of things. And so sometimes it's kind of like when you go to the same job every day for multiple years and you're going that general direction, but you're trying to go to the grocery store. If you're not cognitively like in tune with what's going on and you're kind of spacing out, you end up at work most of the time where you're like, oh, I was going to work. I need to go to the grocery store. You know, our brain automates a lot of things like that. And so apathy in particular is probably more common that I've seen, you know, from the patients that I've dealt with that have been in service because they don't only have usually traumatic brain injuries, but they also have some PTSD. And so that point is where, you know, it doesn't know how to respond. It just doesn't know what to do. It's like you've had a point in your life to where it's focal, and that trauma, unless it's dealt with either with psychology, you know, I'm not a huge fan of medications unless you absolutely have to have them. So that is sometimes, you know, provider preference. You know, they may say, let's put this on for a Band-Aid while we get some psychological, you know, understand where the stimulus is coming from and learn how to deal with it. But there's just so many things that comes with brain injuries that make it very hard and difficult to treat. And most people, their symptoms can be so subtle, they don't even understand that that's what it's coming from. You know, just because you have confusion doesn't mean you have a brain injury. However, if you've had a brain injury or multiple concussions, then confusion is very, very common. You know, you're just not processing everything correctly. So not one of these entities is independent of itself, but some of these symptoms can definitely overlap, which is why neurology can be difficult. We're trying to figure out your story and how things are happening. But in particular, one thing I would like to touch on in regards to, you know, isolation and those feelings of like not wanting to be a burden. You know, apathy is a big part of that. Depression's a big part of that. And one of the neurotransmitter in particular, and this is usually what leads to addiction, is dopamine. So when you have that problem, you know, your dopamine levels are probably not as robust as they should. So apathy is mean lack of emotion. And so what usually gets dopamine levels up is something exciting or a challenge. And so whenever you have a challenge and you complete that challenge, your dopamine levels rise. And so there's other things that mimic. I've been watching a lot of, if you want to learn more about this kind of stuff, like Huberman is a great resource. He talks about it a lot. He talks about, you know, stress, anxiety, what we can do, exercise. You know, these are very small things that in the whole side of thing, but have huge impacts because when you get to that part of having a miscommunication, you have to slowly add things back. You have to slowly put your brain under a different type of eustress or good stress. When I first started working, I had a physician come up to me because I had a lot of test anxiety. And she was talking about, you know, the upside of stress. And one of the things that was mentioned in that book in particular was prisoners of war. And they had two different responses. You know, politics aside, they would talk about the ones that would end up, you know, panhandling or just the stress got so much to where they just could not function or in their normal environment. You know, getting back to civilization is probably one of the biggest barriers that I hear from the, you know, people who've been in service, you know, veterans, you know, the aggression, because they were once utilized, which you guys touched before on multiple of your episodes, but you were once utilized at this. You know what I've done? You know how you know, what I've actually sacrificed, and everyone just treats like it's nothing. You know, what does that do to you psychologically? You know, it's just because you were something different than what you are now. And the reason why you may be something different now is because these subtle symptoms that may have took over. And so that's the way I tend to look at it, and that's the purview I have about it. Other people may have different opinions about it, but you know, it's something that is fairly well studied, but there's just so much out there. When it comes to psychological stuff, it does tend to impede on the physiological. And so the physiological meaning like what we actually do, how we express ourselves, what, you know. And so the dopamine, the rise, is typically only stimulated through either some type of drug, nicotine, alcohol, you know, and it'll just make it rise pretty quickly. But when you go without it, it tends to fall. And that's where the addiction comes in, because the only way you can stimulate it, you know, because you're so apathetic about your environment, is sometimes through another substance or, you know, kind of like when you guys were talking about your stories, you would tell each other, like, we're going to the bar, we're going to go talk about what happened today, and you're kind of unpacking your day. That's the only way you can deal with it, because you numb your brain enough, but you give yourself enough of an experience to where you feel something finally. You know, you feel something great. You know, you suppress all the other stuff, all the negative thoughts and everything else, and you're more like libations make you a little more happy. Same thing with nicotine. Smoking is a real common cause, and I'm starting to understand why, because of what they talk about, like cigarette smoking, vaping, and how nicotine can actually huge increase of dopamine sometimes because it gives you an increase of focus, but it also makes you lackadaisical. Like it's probably one of the only or very few medications that activate what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, which is like the rest and digest is how I always see it, and then the sympathetic, which is kind of like fight or flight.
Yeah.
And so your focus is like intense, but your body is calm. And so people tend to use nicotine a lot when they go through that. And there's minimal health benefits in regards to what the consequences are. And so you can definitely deregulate that, and then that can just lead to a further depression or further anxiety because you don't function like you used to. It's kind of going back to the day where you were, like, oh, I used to be able to bench 425 pounds. Obviously not me. This is this is very clear. But you tend to live in the past more about those things that were the good days, what you thought was the good days. But the more you do that, the more you see sight of current times, and then you tend to focus so much on that. And you tend to lose yourself into what could be, but
Wow.
So
Oh, that's great. And yeah, I mean, right off of the bat, one of your statements of what you said, if you have confusion, doesn't mean that you've had an injury, but if you've had a TBI and you have confusion, that's a common thing. And I remember anybody listening to this video, like I remember being in this fog and being like, what is wrong with me? Like, why? Like, I just felt like I was the only one going through that. And, I just want to say, like, right now on the camera, like, if you've had a TBI, if you're military, law enforcement, whatever it might be, and you've had a TBI and you're feeling confused, you're feeling these symptoms, like, please know you're not alone in that. Like that, right, Ryan? I mean,
it's common. It's common.
Yeah.
That's usually what leads to aggression. And so it seems like, there's always that snowball effect, like something starts out very small, ends up being bigger than what it really needs to be. But again, this is not just like knowledge that's out there to everybody right away. You can get on the internet and find a lot of symptoms, and you can definitely resonate with all that. Does that mean it's absolutely what's happening? Probably not. This is why they make you, kind of follow up with your doctor at least, say, hey, is this common? Is this something I can do? And again, the access is what's happening. That's where we're kind of getting into such an issue now. Like, health access is ridiculous. It's just so hard to get into the doctor because there's so many people that need something. And then, people need it more than others, but then some people that have it, they just don't show up. And so I don't know. You could go either way with that, but it definitely does propose an issue. Because it could be something as small fatigue, and then also the next thing you know, you're getting anxious because you don't know why your brain's doing that. And then your brain's going 100 miles an hour, and it's just confused all the time because it just doesn't know where to send those signals. It has no idea what to do. There's a lot more technical terms that would go with that, but it's just, in general, we'll keep it simple. Let's just keep it like what it is. And so that leads to more anxiety, depression. Why me? Why me? We tend to isolate ourselves because we think something's wrong with us. I always say these are the small lies that the enemy tells us. These are the small lies, and this is the opportunity to take it. And so you have two choices. You can stay there, and once you realize what it could be, you can do something about it to the best of your ability, or you can succumb to it. And succumbing to it is not the way. You guys are talking about being warriors and men of war. Like, you wouldn't do that in battle. You're fighting till the very end. You guys are militants, and that's what you're trained to do. And and I'd say unfortunately, when you're also training, you're trained to be self-efficient too as well. You work as a team, but also if you get separated, they always say the banana away from the bunch is more likely to be eaten. Yeah. So they teach you community, but you tend to steer away from that after the fact, that's always been kind of one of those oddities I never understood. But I mean, I can understand why, because you think you're the only one that has that feeling.
Yeah. I think, man, what a great point. Because Gabe and I have had that conversation a lot of like, here recently we've had a couple of guys who've been in contact with a few guys that have been willing to step out and ask for help and say, man, things aren't going great. And Gabe and I were like, gosh, why didn't we reach out to our community? And, honestly, when I look back, I talked to you more about stuff that was going on neurologically. I talked to several other civilians before I was willing to reach back out to the boys, and
Right.
that were there experiencing as well. And for me, I think it was probably I think it's a pride thing, and I think
Absolutely.
again going back to the burden, like, well, I don't want to burden the guys that are still active duty, or the guys that are still on mission. Like I don't want to. I don't want to waste their time with my issue. Was kind of the feeling, and
Right.
so that's interesting. That's an interesting thought as to why we don't reach out and ask.
Yeah. Well, and men in general, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think that's what we feel like it's almost innate in what we do. You feel like you're born to be a provider. A lot of it's cultural, but also I think a lot of it's innate. Like that's just, if you read back just historically, like men were the breadwinners, but they didn't have a lot of emotion and so you weren't really open. And if you did open up, something was wrong with you. Like, well, hey, that's weird. And I think as culture changes, we tend to see like, hey, it is okay. Like we're not the only ones going through this. And a lot of it, I think, falls around shame. You feel shameful because you're like, what? What are they going to do? What are they going to do to help me? And they're going to be like, oh, wimp. We tell ourselves all these things that, we basically take our perceived insecurities and we project them onto other people before we even talk to them. And so when we're insecure about something that we do, like, I mean, you feel like, oh, I don't want to reach out. Like, I feel like a burden. And I mean, I think that's natural anyways, even when you don't have any of these other problems. They're just more exacerbated or bigger whenever you do have these problems. But like, I was just golfing the other day with a guy that I've met a handful of times, and I saw him on the tee list, and I was like, I was going to golf by myself. And so he was right before me, and I'm like, hey, man, you want to golf together today? He's like, sure. And he was really quiet, gentleman. And so, but I felt this, like, just because he was quiet, he wasn't saying much, that I was kind of ruining his day because my game was not up to his. And I'm like, hey, man, you just, by the way, just know, like, if you feel like you need to run because I'm not playing your pace or something like that, he goes, oh, am I giving you that vibe? I'm like, no, this is all me. This is all
Yeah.
my insecurities. And so, but I also don't want you to feel like I'm going to take it offensive. I'm just not, I'm not easily offended. And pastor of our church, talked about offense one time, and he says offense is a devil's foothold, because if we take offense, that's when you're going to fly off the handle about something. If you're offended, you're either going to say something you don't really want, or it's not really godly, or you're going to say something or think something about yourself that maybe not true. And so if you take offense, it's hard to not do that. But there are some things that I think God wants you to be offended about, in the sense of like, his name, his works, you don't want to take his name in
Yeah.
vain and all those kind of things. But I think as just being a male, if you get offended, you probably more likely are going to internalize it than you are to put it out on someone.
Yeah.
And that's where the pressure starts to build up. Like I always do the tea kettle method. You start burying it, and eventually that tea kettle is going to start whistling. And when it's whistling, that means when your problems are coming through.
Wow. That's what an accurate analogy for the community we're talking to here. I mean, that's the tea kettle is absolutely it. That's what happens is guys just push it down until it's breaking point.
Yeah.
So, and not to put you on the spot here,
Go ahead.
but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
So
Good deal. Thanks for the warning.
yeah. So you're smart enough guy, you can handle it. So you're taking guys, you said it yourself, you're taking guys that have multiple concussions. Mm-hmm. You have guys that have blast concussions. Mm-hmm. You have guys that, there's so many studies coming out now, Ryan, on like how many rounds we shoot, even from small arms, even from just our pistols, from our rifles, just the percussion from that. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of studies coming out on the damage, but nobody knows the extent of the damage. So you have guys that are taking blasts or taking concussions. Now they've gotten out of the military. They do have fear. They do have anxiety. Mm-hmm. Now loss of identity is a huge one. So now you have this emotional piece playing in with legit TBI. Mm-hmm. What does a guy do? We obviously we know the enemy is going to try to work his way into the mix as well, and he's going to try to tell us everything we're not, everything we can't be again. And you and I are in agreement of like, ideally you would just turn to your faith, and
Right.
you can release a lot of that tension, right? But from a scientific standpoint, how can a guy? Is there something a guy can do to kind of help mitigate some of what's going on, some of that confusion, some of
So a lot of it I feel, and again, this is easier said than done. And I tell my patients that all the time. Like what I'm about to tell you, it's going to flow well, it's going to work well, and you're going to hear things. But A, recalling it for one is going to be difficult. But two, putting it into action. I listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson as well, and he's a psychologist that also has significant faith and talks to about the unison of like why our brain does what it does, but also some of the pitfalls of it as well. And so I think I've told you before, but my verse is the Psalm 46:10, be still, until you can get to a still, quiet environment for just a minute so you can actually think clearly. It's almost, you want to decrease that external stimuli. And this is where it typically gets to the point of being too comfortable. You talk about being kind of hoarded up into a house, or, you don't want to go out because you get to the point where you decrease the stimulus in your brain. But just to your point was, percussion, like multiple rounds, especially ear protection, no ear protection, that can make a huge, impact. I did that probably, I don't know, it'd been like 8 or 9 years ago. I was at a friend's house and I had my new 9mm and I did a rapid fire, and I did not really pay attention to my environment around me, but there was a bunch of sheds, metal sheds. And so just the impact of that, I've had tinnitus or the ringing in my ears for the last 9 years. It's never gone away. And so that is just part of the impact that can be problematic. Also, you add that into a traumatic brain injury, that is hard to deal with because all you hear is that ringing, especially if you don't know why you hear it. And it's just like constant. So it's that constant stimuli just going into your ear all the time. You just hear it 24/7. Unless you're in certain environments of noise canceling, certain frequencies will cancel some of that out. And so like when I'm at work, I don't notice it as much because A, I'm focused on something else. And so that's kind of like that distraction technique. You want to be calm still. This is where prayer comes in handy. And then also, I think it was God's intention for us to be around other people because we can't carry these burdens on our own. We can't do this by ourselves. Kind of like you guys mentioned, I think it was last week, the body of Christ. Not all of us are just a hand. Some of us are the brain. Some of us are, the treatment, the compassion, the nurses. Like there's so many people that do things for different ways to make the body work. And so, you have to find, your swim buddy is great. It's a great application here because A, knowing you're not alone is the first step. And then how do you deal with it? And if you can get away from the addiction part of it, that's another whole mountain hill to climb. I mean, that's a whole other mountain. And so I meant to say molehill, but that's a whole other mountain to climb, bigger than a molehill.
Yeah.
But getting out of it, once you've been there, it's one thing at a time, one step at a time, that's why I think relationship with God is so important because when you don't think you have anyone to talk to, you can talk to him. And the more you say out loud, kind of like Gabe was saying that he reads out loud, just to hear the words. And so to say the words that he is saying is not only acknowledging it by in here, but you're hearing it. And it's how many ways can you put it into your body? How many ways can you learn something? You can learn something like kinesthetic learners. They're ones that feel like they need to move around. Now, I'm not sure exactly, how many people believe in kinesthetic learning or whatnot. That's not really the point. But some people just learn better when they're up and moving. Some people learn better when it's still and quiet. The same thing, though, in regards to what's coming into our ear. Like what are we hearing? And some of the stuff isn't even real. We're hearing our own self-talk. And so, getting involved in a church and getting involved in, a group of people that can surround you and it's hard to find sometimes, and you got to be able to trust them. So you don't just like go in blindly, but you got to be able to trust people to just get your back, and that's where I think your swim buddy comes in really handy because you have at least another person to bounce it off of. And then kind of like a social network, right? They may know 3 other people that have been through something similar, and then it's like, oh, they dealt with this. Let me go ask my buddy, And so it's kind of like a networking technique that you guys need to deal with these things. However, there's also that point too of like, there's no shame in getting help either. There's no shame in like saying, I talked to a psychologist today because they can sometimes help isolate things. However, you have to like that person. You have to trust that person. And so you can't just go into any psychologist's office more than likely and get good help. But now, what they have out now, I mean, they have these things where you can just message one of them. Like the technology there, with the visits, like it could be simple as, hey, try this, And psychology can't really prescribe medications, but they can give you techniques. And so one of them is like called cognitive behavioral therapy. And what that does, from my understanding, I'm not a psychologist by any means, but what it does is kind of isolate the initial problem the best to the ability. Like, what is this? What is the precipice of like what happened? Was it that PTSD event? What did you see in battle? Like, what was it? And then how do you unpack that and then process it and deal with it? How do you change your mindset about that? Because there's things you can control, but if you live in the past about all your mistakes and that's what you focus on, you're going to make more mistakes. You can't have a clean slate, and that's what you tell yourself, but it's not true. Unfortunate things happen to people every day, but if you can't find a way to process it and deal with it, sometimes you need help, just someone to talk to that can say, have you ever thought about it this way? Or and some people are like, well, that's kind of crazy. I don't want to be a crazy guy. It's like, I don't ever use that term because I don't believe, that term. There's always a process. There's always a problem that led up to this situation. And so that's my personal, viewpoint on it, is like, never be scared to ask for help. If it's to the point where it's causing a lot of self thoughts and negative thoughts, I'm kind of like Tyler's story. Like the prayer was everything that he needed,
Yeah.
But there's also things that on top of all that, I think God will put you in the right place at the right time if you just constantly just listen in. But you're praying for your buddies. You're telling them you love them. You're showing them that they're worthy, because to feel worthy is not also innate for us. We don't ever feel worthy of anything. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If we really look down at our deep emotions and that kind of like you said, the pride before the fall.
Right.
That's kind of it's kind of how Lucifer got kicked out of heaven, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely it.
So, but
No, and I love those. I mean, thanks for bringing those practical steps up. And again, guys, if you listen to Tyler's story, you listen to Gabe's story. I've talked a lot about my story of just we took this organic approach of just really leaning into faith. I know there's some people are probably skeptical of can that heal, but we're kind of living proof that it yes, like you can be healed. And not saying that the TBI is gone, or obviously you would know from a neuro stance, but it's
I think things happen that I can never explain, and I don't know how many times I've had that happen to where something came up that I mean you just can't explain it. Now whether we just don't know about it, but for my faith, I cannot say it's any short of a miracle. If I can't, I'm not saying I'm all knowing either. Like if I can't explain it, there could be another explanation for it. But when things aren't, they don't follow the book, or something is not what it seems. Some people can always doubt that. You know what I mean? But again, that's not your self doubt. That's someone's like, that can't happen. That's not possible. And so I try not to. I had a physician approach me one time because we had at our church, there was definitely talk about some miracles that were happening that people try to debunk and all these kind of things. And he asked me, well, what do you feel about that? And I'm like, what do you mean what do I feel about that? I'm like, I don't think I can put my God in a box. I mean, like if I put my God in a box that he can't do that, then what am I serving? Yeah. I go, is it hard to believe? Sure. That's the doubt, doubting Thomas. There are things that are hard to believe until, Peter gets on the water, right? And then he starts to lack faith, and it's just like, it doesn't take much. Yeah. However, how I answered it was, I'm like, if I believe my God can't do something like that, then what's the point in serving someone that can't do anything? Even though we can't physically describe it, we're not above him. We're not above understanding what he can do. Our brains can't really comprehend all the things that he can do. I believe in miracles, and when they happen in front of me, I do my best not to doubt him. And it's hard to sit in a church service sometimes and hear some of these things that they call miracles, and from a medical mind, to not doubt that. But it's just like some of those things I just have to let go. I'm like, you know what? Don't be thinking that way. Even real or not real, that doesn't help your faith if you believe it's not real or if you feel like there's another cause. How does that help your faith in moving forward? And so,
Wow.
people may call me crazy, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
We're not told we're going to be liked. We're going to be persecuted one way or the other. But
Yeah.
I'd rather be on the other side of it and just take my licks now, and hopefully have treasures later.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah. You're when you were just saying that story, it reminded me of Ephesians 3:20.
mhm,
God can do immeasurably more than we can ask, think, or imagine.
right,
So when you hear that, yeah, in today's world, like we're like, miracles. That was an Old Testament thing, or
right.
or that was a Bible times thing.
It's like they didn't know any better. They didn't have the science we have. They didn't have the knowledge we have. That's the pride. That's all
Yeah,
pride if you look at it.
yeah,
I proposed a question one time to one of my buddies because me and him talk a lot, and when we talk, it gets ridiculous. It just goes deep, and he's like, "Whoa, whoa, that's awesome." And so, but I don't know where I was at when it came up, but I was just thinking. I was listening to the Bible one day, and I do the 365 every year, so a Bible in a year, and I just
yeah,
change the version, like NLT, NIV, MSG. A lot of it's just to make myself more familiar with it, but also to hear it in different words. Because again, to your point, you can read the same verse over and over, and the next thing you know, it's like, wow, that hit different, as if
yeah,
that would say nowadays.
yeah.
But I was talking to my buddy, and I was like, "Hey, do you think it'd be harder to have faith whenever Jesus was roaming the earth and you were there, like following him, or do you think it's harder to have faith now? Now we know everything. We have historical, explanations of everything. Like, you see it in the Bible over and over and over again and being tested over again. And it comes out true every single time. That should be easier to have faith, right?
Yeah,
But then you have knowledge, the tree of knowledge. I've
yeah,
heard a lot of different things we talk about in regards to knowledge. And, it's like when you understand certain things like why the weather does what it does and all this kind of, all this is just, an observation of God's creation. That's all science is. We're just observing how things interact around us. And sure, we may know more about it and understand it a little better, but it doesn't mean we have control over it, right?
yeah,
And so back then, though, you saw the miracles actually happen in front of you. And you didn't have anything change in your mind about like, oh, that's how that works. Or, so which one
yeah,
would be easier? After you see the historical fact happen and over again, you see the prophecies already fulfilled and everything else. Like, I mean, they even say, like, I forget who it was, but there's a pastor talking out on one of the online sermons I watched one time. And he was talking about that, to fulfill 8 of the prophecies and the probability of that.
yeah. The probability.
Yeah. Is like
Yeah,
to fulfill, I can't remember, I don't want to misquote him, but it's like to fulfill 8, is like 1 in like a trillion or something like that. He goes, to fulfill all of them is to take a bunch of quarters and have one isolated over the whole state of Texas, 2 feet deep, and you reach down the first time and grab that quarter. You know
jeez,
what I mean?
that's
And,
amazing.
and so if you think about that in regards to faith, it's very hard to rebuke that this has happened. We've seen these things happen and happen, and sure we can get kind of like the death clock in or whatever it's called, whatever that clock is called, where it says time's near the end. You can always be in that fear, but I think if you have the relationship, you don't have to be. And if you can get that one fear out of the way, I mean, you just less problems in the future. And so
Yeah,
if we can get ourselves out of fear, because fear is not of God. You should fear God. I mean,
yeah,
He has all the control.
yeah,
He has control of everything, but it's not everything. What I'm saying, it's not. You can live your life a lot easier without a lot of these anxieties and fear, but getting over them is sometimes the biggest part of the battle. And
yeah.
you can't be too You can't be too proud to do that.
No, I think, and you gave some very good practical, kind of what we've been saying, just the swim buddy model. I
Mhm.
think you gave some really good steps of that will allow guys to start that healing process, guys.
Yeah.
And it can be as simple as finding the swim buddy today, and maybe then you evolve into the prayer, the quiet time, the scripture.
Hmm.
That would be, if you can get to that point, if you can start moving that direction. I'm
Yeah.
telling you guys, I'm telling you firsthand, it can quiet the brain a lot. It can quiet the confusion, the noise that might be going on, and And again, if you're a veteran law enforcement out there, reach out to us. We have resources from the Warrior's Journey. You can reach out to me. I can get you put in touch with Ryan if there's a big need.
Yeah.
That's just, we're here to help, guys. And I will touch on one more quick thing, Ryan.
Yeah.
I think when you said, and if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back for another episode. I think there's a whole episode built around the dependency piece. But I think you did a good job of highlighting that we're trying to replace the dopamine. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah, because
And
apathy is common, and again, if you don't have a pursuit, like you hear about the pursuit of happiness. Part of it is actually the pursuit and the journey itself, the things that you have to do for the journey, and that's what typically, from what I understand in regards to dopamine, it's that the small accomplishments. You make one small step in the right direction, that can trigger a dopamine response. But again, those are the things that are somewhat affected in regards to TBIs. I mean, you have a missed connection there that is not fully derived, and dopamine's probably a big one in regards to the apathy part. Because you just can't stimulate it, and so that's the part where in regards to addiction and trying to understand why you feel that way. It's going to be hard when you're in a deficit. And so that you're below the threshold. And so especially with those addictions, they do make them rise quickly. But if they rise quickly, they fall just as quick and they go below the threshold of where we're supposed to live at. And so it tends to be an endless pit of you can't get out. And that's what over time can be what takes over if you allow it. But, even though it's a hard step, get in with a buddy that's been through the hard steps, that says, this is how I dealt with this. This is how I went there. Because if you start there, you social network into a bunch of other people, and some people have already sought help, and they're like, "Hey, I know a good guy that a good psychologist that helped me through a lot of these things." We don't always have to seek care, but I would highly recommend it in the sense of if you have the ability to and the means, especially since the wait times are so long, like get in, at least get checked, because if it's not that big of a deal and it's not that big of a problem to where your TBI is maybe not that bad. Or, and then some of this stuff is just more of self-inflicted over time. That's the part, those may be easier holes to get out of for you. Yeah. But you truly have a transmitter problem. Maybe you need a little medication to kind of help level that out a little bit. Because that leads to a lot more further disease processes down the road. And that's the part that we worry about, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, those are big ones. There's a part of our brain that I talk about a lot with what we call functional patients. And these patients are actually, fine. Like their brain is actually fully well and intact. But because of their stress, their anxiety, their PTSD, their bipolar, whatever it is, it hits on something called the AMCC, the anterior mid-cingulate gyrus or cortex. And so this is kind of where I always see it as the physiological and psychological are married. So like people who have problem public speaking, they may develop a rash. That is a psychological step process that leads to a physiological rash. Some people can come in with like seizure activity that we say, oh, there's no seizures. We can't find them. We can't see them. We can't see any cause of them. And based on how they look, or what we call the semiology of the seizures, you can kind of tell, well, that's not typical. And if it's atypical, you start thinking these things and you start asking these questions like, what are you going through? And I don't know how many times I've opened up conversations with patients. I'm like, what else are you going through? And all this aside, like, what else are you going through? And they start spilling out some things, and I'm like, I think we may have a possibility of a cause. If I can't find anything on the physiological part of the brain, then I start looking at the psychological part, because that part is where, in some people, and I don't think military, they're going to be underdeveloped by any means because all the training, the rigorous training you go through. But maybe sometimes when you get out of it and you're not in that rigorous training anymore, do they tend to get smaller or atrophied, or, do they change? I don't know that to that science. Huberman may tell you more about that kind of stuff. But this is something I do talk about a lot in regards to why we see really odd phenomenons in patients that have these PTSDs and depression and anxiety. Like their brain just cannot continue to function in that high alert state. I mean, you're just constantly running in your head about something. Until you can slow that down, it's hard to have a normal thought, And so that's where CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy is also very beneficial if that is part of the issue. But again, this is not a blanket statement that everyone's suffering from the exact same thing. I want to make that clear. So, but get in touch with someone for sure.
What's that?
I said definitely get in touch with someone though. You know what I mean? Like whenever
absolutely.
The buddy system is probably by far, the swim buddy is by far the best way to start your networking, because you're going to find people that you trust that went to other people that you're like, you know, I really trust this guy. And that helps a lot when you're going into it.
Yeah.
So for sure.
Yeah. And I found, you know, raising the kind of what my final thought was with the dopamine of like replacing, you know, again, if there's a full blown addiction, there's probably some medical intervention that needs to take place, or some, you know, some actual healing from that. But if it's just a habit at this point, and there's too much drinking because you're trying to get that dopamine, you know, one thing I realized is like just coming up with different hobbies, getting back into the gym, shooting guns again with buddies, or, you know, whatever it might be, going to the golf course. And there are other alternatives that can help.
Well, that's what I was talking about, like the pursuit of happiness. You know, it's that pursuit, those small goals. If you just make smaller goals for yourself in regards to, you know, you can actually train your brain to start releasing that again and again. Essentially, if you don't have a bad TBI, that's where it's going to be very difficult. That would require a clinician to actually assess that. However, but if it's just, you know, if you just try the small things first, I'm always like, what harm is there in trying this, to where you say, I'm going to make a small goal for myself today and just complete that. I know you guys may have had this in the military or not, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of, I know Peterson talks about it a lot. He talks about, you know, the simple task of just making your bed every day. As soon as you get out of bed, completing that first task and feeling of achievement, it's a rise in dopamine.
That's right.
You know, going to the gym, I'm gonna do this today, and then you go to the gym and you put your focus there. If you tend to put your focus in the right directions, you start to realize what little impact the other stuff have on you, and then you can kind of get away from them. It seems the more that one thing I used a lot whenever I struggled, and I still struggle every day with certain things in regards to how I act or how I do things or my sleep habits or whatever. I mean, you know, addiction is just a word for, you know, one's not worse than the other. You know, you may trade one out for another one, maybe fairly healthy, but it also may not be.
Yeah.
You know, like I'll sit there and watch YouTube for hours just because I love to learn. I love to learn all these things and all these other perspectives from everyone else. You know, like I listen to Huberman a lot. I listen to Jordan Peterson a lot. I listen to, you know, I watch a lot of good golf. It's just, I don't know, just certain little things, and I get in those little wormholes. And the next thing you know, I'm not sleeping well, and I'm going to work exhausted, and that has a negative impact. I mean, but it's just when I'm in my Bible every day, though, that changes my whole, kind of like you have been saying this whole time, like that can change your whole mindset for the day. It can prepare you. Put on God's armor. It can prepare you. You know, it's a different mindset. And if you can get in and make that the goal of the day, to get through a 15, 20-minute devotion or just a 15, 20-minute reading, that's one little thing that can increase your dopamine.
Yeah.
And God's going to bless that.
Absolutely.
In my opinion. I mean, He's going to bless it.
Absolutely. We'd encourage you guys to continue. We've laid that out several times, like you said. So yeah, I would definitely recommend doing that. You got the swim buddy, you got the 15 minutes a day minimum, getting in there, getting in the Word, you know, get back into the gym, write those small lists. I do that same thing. I write a small list every morning, and I start checking off. I made them very basic just for that reason. I probably didn't even know that's why I was doing it, but like literally like have breakfast with the family, do my Bible reading. Like I check them off because it's like those are wins.
It feels good. It feels good. When you feel accomplished, you feel better.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to do that when you're seeking other things. It's just, you know, if you put those as your main focus, man, it can change your whole mentality. When things are bad, you got to change your focus. And maybe you're not in a good situation. Like that's the other part too. It's hard to say. You know, there's a plethora of things that attack us every day, and it's going to happen. It's going to be there every day. And so, do you fight it or do you lay down? I mean, that's your options.
Wow, that's a great final statement right there, man.
Thank you.
I love it.
So,
well, Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time, man.
Yeah.
This is great stuff. I hope you understand how much value you're bringing.
Well, it's actually my pleasure. Like I told you before, I'm just here to serve any way that I can. If God will use me, then I will take it any way I can. So,
yeah, well, we definitely appreciate it, and I think we'll have to get round 2 set up pretty quick. I think there's a whole topic around, you know, the substance abuse, the addiction, the radical behavior that kind of comes along with a lot of our issues as well. So I think let's get round 2 on the books, and Can't wait to have you back, man. So,
Just give me a call.
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time, brother.
Yep.
All right, Men of War, signing off. There it is. You got it.
See ya.
All right.
All right.
See ya.
Catch you later.